So the way that we usually read this story about Adam, Eve, and the serpent is kind of like what Elizabeth said earlier, right? We say that, God says, now, don't eat that tasty looking fruit. And we imagine that it's just like a parent, just like mom, getting those chocolate chip cookies out of the oven, putting them on the counter, and saying, now, don't eat any of these cookies while I go out visiting. But is it really like that? I mean, to put it that way, who wouldn't eat the fruit? Who wouldn't eat the delicious fruit? But the story doesn't really go like that. First of all, it's not like the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the only option in the garden, right? There are lots and lots of choices. The same words appear in Genesis 2 and describe a lot of trees in the garden, that they are pleasing to the eye and good for food, just like the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So there are tons of options, and God explicitly says, you could eat from any of these trees, any of them, take your pick. There are plenty of attractive choices. There's pears and plums, pomegranates, mangoes, kiwi. And God says, just stay away from the Granny Smith apples. They're not good. They're going to be a bad side effect from those apples. But pretty much anything else, go ahead, take your pick. And this changes the story a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, the other big difference between the biblical story and the story about the chocolate chip cookies is that Adam and Eve do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil without some external encouragement, right? There's this serpent that prods them toward eating. Now sure, the desire to eat might be inside them already, but it isn't really a problem until the serpent comes along. After all, they have this huge variety of other delicious fruits to eat. What's the big sacrifice in not eating from this tree? I mean, God, whom they love and trust, just asked them not to eat from it, and they have tons of other options. No huge sacrifice at all. Until the serpent comes along and says, this is really the best fruit in the garden. I mean, that's the fruit that makes you like God. It's amazing stuff. That's the fruit that you really, really want. And once that thought gets planted in their heads, they can't think of anything else. They're like, wow, this is the cool fruit. That's the fruit that everybody wants. Well, I mean, if there were other people, everybody would want it, right? The snake says, that's the fruit that's really awesome. And desire gets planted in their hearts. And I say their hearts, plural, because even though the serpent only directly addresses Eve and only Eve answers the snake, if you look closely at the text, Adam is standing there with her the whole time. It's not like Eve is hanging out with the serpent by the tree and then 2 hours later she says, hey Adam, by the way, I tried this really good fruit, you want some? No, they're in this together from the beginning. And once they see the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is to be desired to make one wise, they start down the wrong path. Now we know desire itself isn't bad. It's what you desire. What's the direction of your desire? That's what makes it good or bad. The desire for enjoying good, delicious food, there's probably nothing wrong with that, right? The desire to be God, the desire to be able to decide what's good and evil, that's probably not a desire that's going to serve human happiness. God doesn't want to keep the fruit away from humans because God is somehow afraid that humans will get as smart as him, right? I mean, God is always going to be the smartest person in the room. God's not concerned about that. But God knows that knowledge of good and evil will be misused by humans, that it will not lead to human flourishing. And of course, God is right. Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and suddenly they realize that they're naked. Now, this is kind of interesting, since chapter 2 ends with the words, the man and his wife were naked, and they were unashamed. So, I think they could see each other before this, right? Their vision was working okay. Not only were they naked, they were enjoying being naked before this. But then their eyes are opened. There's something wrong now with being naked. They start to judge one another. Of course, they knew that they were different before, but now that difference might not be a good thing. And they start to judge themselves as no longer good, as evil. They hear God walking in the garden just like God always used to walk in the garden in the cool of the day, and for the first time ever, they're afraid. Now notice that God has not said anything yet. The human beings are afraid and they hide, not because God has said that they're evil, but because they have judged themselves. They have marked themselves as evil, and now they don't know how to relate to God anymore. They are afraid of the God who made them, the God who still loves them. They don't want anything to do with God. Does that sound like anybody that you know? God says, "Where are you?" Now, do you really think that God doesn't know where they are? I mean, seriously. This is where the analogy with a little kid really does work. It's like when the little kid does something wrong and runs into the bedroom and hides under the covers in the middle of the bed. And you go looking for him. It's like, I wonder where he is. Don't know. Must be invisible. God knows. God says, "Where are you?" as an invitation. It's a first invitation to come back into relationship, to admit what has happened, and to start the journey toward reconciliation. When Adam admits that he hid because he's naked, God offers another chance to start this ball rolling toward repairing the relationship. Who told you were naked, God asks. It's like God is asking, who told you that you were incomplete? Who told you that there was something wrong with you? God asks, have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? Again, it's not like God doesn't know the answer to this question already, but it's another invitation to Adam to say, I've been wrong, to confess, to start to repair this relationship. And notice that God is not angry. The text says nothing at all about God being angry. Sure, God recognizes that they moved outside of God's will. They ate the fruit. They failed to trust God. That wasn't part of God's intent. All of that is true. However, the judgment that they make on themselves, that they are evil, that they should be afraid of God, that is not true. They are still made in God's image. They are still part of that wonderful creation that God made and saw was very good. But they can't see themselves that way any longer. They chose to put themselves in the place of judgment, of deciding what is good and evil. And the first thing that they called evil was themselves. With the question, have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? God gives Adam that second chance to confess and recognize the lie. The lie that Adam's judgment of himself as evil and that he's no longer worthy of God's love is just simply not true. But Adam can't take the opportunity. Instead of confession, Adam goes the other route and starts playing the blame game. Right? Instead of taking responsibility and saying, I want to repair this, how can I fix this? Adam says, well, you know, God, that woman that you gave me, if you just hadn't put this woman in the picture, everything would have been fine. It would have been okay. And then Eve does the same thing, right? Well, you know, God, if it hadn't been for that serpent, everything would have been fine. Everything would have been just great. That downward spiral of judgment, of saying not only identifying themselves as evil, but starting to say that others are evil has started. You're evil. That person is evil. That serpent is evil. And it's just a small step from you're evil to you deserve to die. And that's the downward spiral that starts right here. How do we get out of this? How do we get out of this? You know, the gospel shows us how we get out of this. The kids showed us how we get out of this. Jesus is able to resist that desire, right? Satan gives him all the possibilities, right? Make stones into bread. Wow, imagine how amazing you would be if you did that. You would take care of your own needs and everybody would come to you. You know, jump off the top of the temple and float down, and everybody is going to want to be like you. Everybody's going to just follow you wherever you want to go. And you could be king of the world. Who doesn't want to be king of the world? And Jesus is able to say, you know, all of those things, I don't need them. And the reason I don't need them is I know who I belong to. I know that I can trust my Father. I know that I'm a child of God. I know he knows because he's been baptized, right? Just before this. We tend to think, well, Jesus, you know, he's the Son of God, and so, of course, he can resist all these temptations, but what about us? We can't do that. There's no way we can do that. But Jesus resists these temptations in the power of the Spirit, in the power of his baptism. So right before this, he's baptized in the Jordan, and God says, you are my beloved Son. The Spirit drives him out into the wilderness, and he knows the Spirit is with him. He knows the Spirit is empowering him, and he is able to remember who he is, the Son of God. The same is true of us. Same is true for Cody. From this day on, his parents will remember that he's a child of God. And he'll grow up as a child of God. That will be his identity, just like it's your identity. You are a child of God. And when we remember that, temptation doesn't have the glitter. It doesn't draw us in like it used to, because we know who we are. Thanks be to God.